When the evil Julian heard this voice, he reproached the torturers for not having removed enough of Christine's tongue, telling them to cut it so close that she would be unable to converse with her Lord Jesus. They cut off the whole of her tongue, right down to the root, but she spat out these remains in the tyrant's face and blinded him in one eye. Speaking just as easily as ever, she exclaimed, "Tyrant, what was the point of your removing my tongue so that I couldn't praise God, when my spirit will praise him for evermore, whilst yours is damned for all eternity? It is only fitting that my tongue should have blinded you, since you didn't believe my words in the first place."
Ho-ri-o, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And it's lovely to see you again. I have to warn you at the top, I may be coming down with something, and hopefully I won't be coughing all over this episode and making it sound terrible. But, we'll try to salvage that in the edit.
Also, the cats have been running back and forth, making strafing runs. One just jumped on the table, so it's going to be an interrupted session.
Yeah, and that may be appropriate. We're starting our cluster on women writers and their issues about getting into the canon. You picked a very visceral piece of writing to open this episode with, and a really interesting one that I don't know if I would have thought of immediately to put in this context of women writers trying to become included as part of the canon.
Yeah, I think that when we think about women writers and we look back at books by women, whether we're looking way back into the medieval past or whether we're looking at contemporary literature, the cat is trying to get onto the microphone, so clearly he wants to be heard. We're almost always talking about a question of voice, of being able to speak, of being allowed to speak, of having speech interrupted, speech prohibited, even speech violently suppressed. And in this passage, we see that happening ineffectually. Speech still happens in this angry, powerful, even kind of warrior-like way. It's something that only happens once we get well into the third book, the last book of Christine de Pizan's City of Ladies. So she really works up to that moment, but I think she doesn't pull any punches when she does.
I think one of the things that we'll definitely find in this collection of three very different works, which is going to be the Book of the City of Ladies, a medieval text by Christine de Pizan that we're talking about today, Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Those are all three very different books. And while they are all concerned with women and women's status as people, basically.
And how you might speak and whether you might write.
Yes.
They're all very self-reflective in that way, I think.
But I also think that they're not necessarily going to make any kind of statement about women as a category, or at least not one that's consistent across the board. This isn't an attempt to define women, at least not on our part, but it is looking at a few different selections of how different women historically have maybe tried to position themselves.
Yeah. I think this question of how do you position yourself really is exactly right. Each one of these writers is very preoccupied with how they're seen. And they will talk explicitly about that, but they also deal with it very subtly in implicit ways. And I don't want to kind of preempt what we might conclude or the view we might have once we finish doing all three of these episodes. But looking ahead, I really get the sense that every one of them is trying to figure out what's the position from which I speak? What's the ground of that? How can I claim that territory in a way that is assertive and yet, at least in there's meowing happening over here. Assertive, yet sometimes also very discreet and working within established systems. So I think that common ground is going to be really interesting to think about together. It's not just women who deal with that, obviously.
No.
There are a lot of people who deal with that.
Absolutely. But it also sounds like that is a description of your own issues about thinking about women in the canon and representation.
Yeah. I mean, without getting too deep into the woods of thinking about the whole question of canon formation and what are great books, when we do a survey course, how we make the choices we make, what we put in an anthology. Well, as I said before, when we put in women writers, are we making an exception? Are we saying, well, this is a box we have to tick? Or are we endeavoring to sort of understand something more broad about the ways in which people write, the ways in which people live their lives? And so how do you do that? Do you just say, well, I will always make sure to include a representative sample? Or do you say, you know what, there's a problem. Let's talk about it. Why is it that we do things like have anthologies of women writers or a course on women writers? What's happening there? Are we doing something very positive in terms of foregrounding and centering those voices, or are we further marginalizing them? As you can tell, I have a lot of feelings about this, and I've thought about it for a long time. It's something I wrestle with in my own scholarship. And I think a lot of people wrestle with this issue one way or another, even if they're not doing it consciously.
Well, I'm curious because you have worked on the Norton Anthology of World Literature, and I believe you were working on the medieval cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Was this question on your mind as you were choosing the texts about different types of representation and representing women in particular?
Mm-hmm.
Did you? I assume you included this text.
Yeah, absolutely. I was working on the medieval volume of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. It's a 6-volume anthology, and the medieval volume, I'm calling it medieval volume. The dates on it really are 100 to 1500, which is a very strange way of conceiving of the medieval, but put that aside for the moment. There had already been some attention to the inclusion of women writers well before I got involved in the project, like maybe a decade ago or so. But when I was working on it, I was thinking about this in concert with thinking about women writers in other parts of the world. In other words, I wasn't thinking about women writers in the context of Western literary history. I was thinking about women writers in the context of a configuration that would be what I was calling circling the Mediterranean, thinking about how literatures in the Islamicate world, in Christendom, and from a whole range of different cultural and religious formations around the Mediterranean interact. So in that context, I was thinking about women writers in the Western tradition, Christine de Pizan, Marie de France, and so on. But I was also thinking about in the cluster of poetic short poems, finding women writers from Persian literature, for example, that I could include, like Jehan Khatun. So thinking about women writers across cultural formations. So that was one context in which I've been thinking about the women writers question and how that plays out in canon formation. And sort of beyond that, I'm sorry, I'm completely distracted by these cats because they're like, wrestling on the table. They got the, the ear thing going. They're ready to rumble.
They're in the mood to play. Oh, wait. Well,
I think I'm going to exit. I'm
yeah.
so excited. Oh, sorry about that. I had to put the cats away because they were getting a little out of control, wanting their voices to be heard. But the other place I've been thinking about it, and this is maybe a little bit specialized, but I think it's kind of a good illustration of what you deal with. I've been interested in Christine de Pizan for a long time, partly just through teaching, but partly also in my research because I work on, medieval literature broadly, right? So figures like Dante, Boccaccio, Chaucer. Christine de Pizan just fits very naturally within them because she self-consciously puts herself in that tradition. She's thinking about herself as a writer among those writers. She draws on their works, reflects on them. She's engaging in a conversation with those works. And so when we talk about the reception of Christine de Pizan, how she was read, in her own time, she was super popular for well over a century after her death. She was translated from French into English, also into Portuguese, into other languages. But then she drops out of sight for a long, long time. And her works get revived in the 20th century when people start getting interested again in women's history, in women writers, and sort of reviving them. Even thinking about Christine de Pizan as a kind of proto-feminist. This happens early in the 20th century, right? So her works come back. And so attention started getting given to her works from a scholarly point of view, beginning, to a certain extent in the mid-20th century, but really in the 1970s is when it takes off. And so you would think, oh, great, now people are going to be thinking about her in concert with these other writers. But no, what happens is you get books and articles on Christine de Pizan, and you get a Christine de Pizan Society and so on. But it tends to be in isolation. People work on Christine, but it's kind of hived off by itself in a sort of, I don't know what to call it, almost a little ghetto of women's writing. Very difficult to find her treated really as taking part in that conversation that she worked so hard to be part of. So one of the things I've been kind of wrestling with and writing about her, at one point I thought, I'll write a book about Christine de Pizan. Then I thought, no, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. I'll write a book about her and somebody else. So writing a book about her and Chaucer and interweaving it in such a way that it'd be very hard, I think, to get away, to come, if you came at that book because you were interested in Chaucer, it'd be very hard to get away without learning something about Christine de Pizan. So that's kind of a long digression, but it's my take on how difficult it is to wrestle with the question of women writers. And the fact that I put it as like a question tells you something right there. So what do you remember about the City of Ladies? I can't remember if it's one of the texts that we taught together the year we did it, or was it not?
It is. We did teach it, which was a fascinating experience, which I'd like to get back to. But first, let me say what I remember of it. So it starts with an amazing passage. It starts with her working in her study, trying to increase her knowledge, trying to learn all sorts of things, and feeling a little tired from having learned so much, and thinking, oh, I'm going to relax a bit. I'm going to read some poetry that I've been meaning to get to, just get to that to-read pile that's been next to my desk. And she starts reading it, and the text is just wildly misogynistic, she finds, and it just crushes her, and she really feels this moment of, everything I read is misogynistic. Everything is terrible. And, I guess these things that I know to be true about myself, that I'm rational, that I'm not evil, that all these basic fundamental things, 100,000 misogynists can't be wrong. Like, I guess I'm broken. Like, I guess this is true since so many people agree with it. It's this fantastic moment of crisis. And it's one of the most, I always found it one of the most striking pieces of medieval literature and one of the most modern feeling, in a sense, that sense of understanding what we would now call the patriarchy, or what we would now call, just having this moment of being overwhelmed by everything that's fighting against you. It then progresses to a visit by these three ladies, these personifications of virtues, I guess, Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. And they say, we've chosen you, Christine, to build the City of Ladies, which is basically the book that is going to gather together all of these stories of great women who are either overlooked or misinterpreted through male writers. And they each take a turn. Well, they describe the city, and then they each take a turn describing who is going to be populating the city. All of these different women.
Yeah. They don't just describe the city. They actually build the city.
That's true.
I mean, that's the really, I think, overpowering neat thing about it is that the telling of the stories and the writing of the stories is the building of the city. So it's not like an account of a building. It's an actual building in writing, which is, I think, kind of cool.
It is. It really does this interesting blurring the lines between being a sort of parable about you're going to build the city and actually describing the physical processes of it and the population of it and what happens when the city is finished at the end of it. The bulk of the text are these little biographies of women throughout the ages and how their stories have been told, and what the real story is, or better ways to interpret what the stories are. So when we taught this book, a lot of our students weren't prepared for the genre of it, I found. This was the first book that we taught that they hated, which was crushing for me to hear. Some of that felt like it was a bit sexist, that it was coming from a place of this is the first woman we're talking about, and therefore it is easier to criticize her. She's not as automatically lofty as Homer or Plato or Virgil or Dante.
And also she's not discreet about being a women writer. She doesn't hide being a women writer. The book is about being a woman and the problems there.
Yeah. And it wasn't just men who were
for sure
saying mean things about her. Yeah, it was women as well. And
did they see it as kind of, I don't want to say ridiculous, but as unnecessary, like fighting battles that are long since won, that are irrelevant?
No, I think part of it is that they just found it boring, that they didn't necessarily have as much of a context for what Christine was doing.
Yeah.
And part of that is that you need to be somewhat invested in these historical characters to get through a lot of these stories. You need to have some sense of who Medea is if you're going to want to read a biography of Medea that makes her out to be a good person that is somehow worthy of emulation and belonging to the City of Ladies. Yeah. And if you don't really have any sense of stake in that, it's not going to work as well.
Well, I'm thinking about it as you're saying that. And you could say that of Dante, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, but they love Dante,
That's
right?
True.
And so then what's the answer? Do you say, oh, well, no, Dante is a great poet, right? So is that the ground? I mean, is it the case that Christine de Pizan is not that great a writer? That's what they're responding to? Or is there a whole set of presuppositions, a whole set of contexts that are largely invisible, Like, I don't think she's a great poet. She wrote in both poetry and prose, and I find her prose way more interesting than her poetry because her ideas are really interesting. I don't think her poetry is that beautiful or compelling. I just don't. I think the same thing about Chaucer. I don't think as a poet he's that compelling, but I think he's really interesting ideas, right? Dante, on the other hand, is a beautiful poet, right? But so I think she has really interesting ideas. And I'm wondering, to what extent this is a question of an aesthetic critical judgment students are making, and to what extent it's a kind of recoiling from the subject matter. I don't know. I don't know the answer to it. They didn't like Augustine either, right? So what are you going to do?
They didn't, but they didn't respond as poorly. I mean, I think also it's a genre thing. If you try to read this text from cover to cover, as many ambitious freshmen will do, then it's just kind of boring. Like it is one story after another.
They didn't have the same complaint about Ovid, though, did they? The Metamorphoses.
We didn't have them read it.
Okay.
We didn't. I don't know. Maybe we failed to explain ahead of time how they should go about reading it. That they should just read the introduction, read the opening and closing of each major section, each of the
Yeah.
3 sections of the book, and then pick and choose a few of the example stories that relate to something that you may know about, you may have already read about, or just catch your eye for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Did you have any students who liked Christine de Pizan?
I think I helped win some of them over a little bit, but I remember that being a very sad wall of nope.
Yeah.
Why are we reading this? What is this?
So if we had a year of books that were all books by men, do you think any of your students would have minded?
No. Well, I don't know.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't particularly think they would.
Yeah,
but
that's interesting, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's depressing.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it says something about us, and it says something about us too, what you were commenting on, that it's not that your male students in the class were the ones who didn't like it and the female students liked it. There's something else going on here. There's, I think, a kind of embarrassment. I don't think that's wrong. An embarrassment in talking about gender and in talking about the ways in which certain forms of situatedness in society limit who can speak and who can't speak. Anyway, again, I don't want to get too polemical about it. And I'm not like, oh, you all must read Christine de Pizan. But I think she ends up being a little bit of a flashpoint, even now, a little bit of a flashpoint in this whole question of what we read, why we read it, what should be read, what's irrelevant, and what we're kind of blind to.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about Christine, the person, about her biography? Because it's very interesting.
Yeah, she's an interesting person. I mean, she sounds like, I shouldn't project, but she sounds like personality-wise, she might have been kind of annoying and a little, incessant know-it-all-ish. But interesting life. Originally from Italy. Her father went to the French court in Paris to serve the court of the King Charles V in the 1300s. And so Christine was from Italy, but was raised at the French court where her father had a really important position. He was the court astrologer to Charles V, which sounds crazy, but in fact, it means he was a trusted counselor and the physician, the primary physician to the king. And so Christine refers back to these years as really golden, happy years. So she was born in around 1364, dies in the early 1400s, like 1420s somewhere. And she has this sort of early life. She describes her own upbringing a number of times in these autobiographical sections in a few different works of hers, including The City of Ladies. And she describes her father as someone who's deeply interested in her education. And this is crucial because women in the Middle Ages, when they have an education, it's either because they had the good fortune to be sent off to a religious community, a monastery or convent, where they would have a meaningful education, or in the case of women who didn't have an upbringing in a monastery or a convent, because they had fathers who, generally speaking, did not have sons and therefore exerted all their educational efforts on their daughters. Christine's a funny case because she had brothers, but her father nonetheless seems to have really been interested in her education. So she refers to this in a number of places. So she married in her teens, had a few different children, two sons and a daughter, and was married to a secretary, a functionary in the French court. And she seems to have had a very happy life. However, the king, Charles V, died and was succeeded in the 1380s. And so the patronage relationship that had been so important for the family was no longer there. Her father died, and Christine found herself in her 20s responsible financially for her own 3 children. She had just been widowed, so she's responsible for her own children, her widowed mother, and a niece, trying to make a living, trying to keep above water in late 14th century Paris. And her brothers had returned back to the family business in Italy. So she's really on her own. And she writes about this. I mean, that I think is the really interesting thing. Sure, there are many people who struggle with certain kinds of circumstances in daily life, but she actually writes about what that was like. And that passage you were talking about in the beginning of The City of Ladies, where she describes being beaten down and kind of hopeless. I mean, that's just one of those autobiographical passages, which is autobiographical and also not at all. You're describing that as a deeply moving and strikingly original, almost modern feeling scene. But at the same time, it's an intensely derivative scene or intensely intertextual scene because she's echoing a passage in one of the most famous books of her own time, a passage from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a much earlier medieval work that also talks about the experience of being downcast in a terrible situation, in jail, condemned to death, like really bad situation. And a glorious presence comes in Boethius's case, philosophy, and straightens things out. So in a way, it's tremendously, I guess you could even say, not derivative, but she's consciously and deliberately imitating a scene she's counting on her readers to know. So she's in a conversation with that scene. And also, it's completely different because it's intensely personal and it's about a kind of experience that very few people have had, right? Women writing about how impossible and unthinkable it is to sort of assert yourself in writing, right? I mean, how many texts do we have doing that? Not a lot.
You're totally right. And I think one of the interesting distinctions between those two is that I don't know, I've never been in jail
Mm.
awaiting my death sentence. Like that seems like a very specific context. But I can totally imagine lots of people having that moment, especially lots of academics, I suppose, or lots of readers having that moment when they're in their room trying to read something and then just get beaten down by it and have a very sad time of it. And then usually personifications of reason don't show up in their bedroom, but still, it's somewhat more relatable. And that's why it feels more modern in a sense to me than
Yeah.
Boethius. Did you ever have that kind of experience as a, female reader and writer and academic, of that moment where you're just working on something and you just feel overwhelmed by those kinds of issues?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I haven't felt beaten down in that particular kind of way where I felt as though I couldn't make headway sort of in my intellectual life or professional life. I have definitely felt that way in my personal life, and as I think about that, and I think about that against Christine's description of her own experience, that kind of sense of hopelessness, I feel very fortunate to have lived really just, I think, almost in the first generation, where women could think about being very serious about their academic careers. And I'm thinking about academia in particular, but I think this is probably a broader point as well. And also have children. Like I have 4 kids. Not a lot of women in research positions in academia have a lot of kids, in my generation at least, right? And I remember being very mindful of this when I was in graduate school because I had female mentors that I was working with. And one of them, who was significantly older than me, maybe 30 years older than me. She had said, I remember her saying distinctly, "Oh, I decided early on that I would definitely not have children. I didn't really want children. It was fine." But she was just very clear about having thrown herself wholeheartedly into a career, and this was not a problem for her. Another one of the mentors, though, that I knew, I remember very vividly sitting in her office when I was a graduate student, and her saying that had been a really wrenching decision for her, that it had been a thinkable thought for her to have children and have a career. And she clearly reluctantly decided that was not a thing she would do. And I remember at the time being so struck by that because I was, I had just had my first child at that time in graduate school. I remember thinking, it's changing, and it's changing so fast within a generation and a half. It's changing where for that one woman, if you really loved your work and you really wanted to do that work, it was not even a question whether you were going to have kids. And then for the other person I mentioned, who was maybe like 10, 15 years older than me, so less than a generation, it was a thinkable thought, but ultimately had to be given up on. And then for me, I was like, well, maybe it's a little risky. People thought I was kind of crazy having kids in grad school, but it worked out fine. So when you think about this sort of sense of overwhelming burden and feeling like you can't get through a bad situation, I do know what that feels like. But I can also say I've never felt that in the study, as it were, right? Mm. Which is where Christine places herself. I never felt it there. That's in fact the place where I felt freest, which is kind of paradoxical, right? So it's weird that I'd be interested in Christine's experience because it's such a almost the inverse to my own.
It is, but the way that you just described it, or the way that you just contextualized it, made me realize something which I'd never thought about before, and more of the shame on me for this, I suppose, but that although she doesn't make it explicit, Christine wrestling in her study, trying to learn things and increase her knowledge and ability, is her trying to be a professional, because she makes her money off of her writing and off of her ability to think and her ability to argue. She's a public intellectual in her time, and that's part of why she has her patronage, and that's part of what feeds her kids. So this question, it's not just a personal thing. It's not just her feeling beaten down personally. It's her feeling like she is being kept from being able to do the things that, so to speak, put food on the table for or at least make her have a professional existence in the career that she seems made for. Well, I think we should start moving into the actual biographies that the various ladies present to her. So the first set of them are presented by Lady Reason. And how would you describe what ties these women together?
Yeah. So I just want to say parenthetically, you're describing them as Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. And that's absolutely right, because that's what the translation does with them. But it's, again, one of these interesting little examples of what translations do in terms of, I don't want to say skewing, like not in a bad way, but, altering the ways in which you take the text. When you read Christine's work in the original Middle French, she describes these women who come to her not as personifications, which is what we would call them, but crowned ladies, right? So they're clearly magnificent. They're resplendent. They're clearly not quite of this world. That's evident, but they're crowned ladies, dame couronnées, right? And she doesn't call them, lady this, lady that. The women introduce themselves by their names as reason, as rectitude, as justice. And they hold off introducing themselves. Like you have a pretty prolonged period of time with each of them where you're looking at them in the text. Christine's describing them to you. They're talking about their instruments that each of them holds. One of them a mirror, one of them a ruler, one of them a measuring cup. And so you don't get their names until a little bit further along. So it's almost like a guessing game. You're like, this person is clearly more than just a person. They're what you'd call in Old French a personnage, a personification, a representation of a person. But you don't quite know what they are until they reveal their names to you. So there's this kind of sense of hiddenness about them. And then what they do is they build the city with Christine. And it's really weird. Like they're remote and lofty, but they're also very intimate. They call her Christine, my daughter, or my dear Christine, or Christine, my child. They use these endearing turns of phrase. So they're at one and the same time in a kind of remote, lofty relationship to her, but also very intimate. There's this one moment when one of the ladies, I think it's Reason, says, we need to lay these foundation stones. Let me get down in the trench with you and help you with this. So there's this sense of this loftiness that's also very intimate and side by side. So again, this is on the one hand very much in keeping with other medieval writers who use these kinds of personifications, these abstractions. They're not normally getting down and getting dirty in the mud with you, but Christine's personifications do that. Yeah, it's weird.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember in Boethius whether Lady Philosophy, or just philosophy as I believe she's referred to in the text, if she does anything particularly physical or, bodily.
No, her appearance is described, but doing things, engaging physically, that stuff doesn't happen. That's something that's different in Christine. So that's what I mean about her. That's one of the reasons I find her very interesting. She's constantly engaged with other writers, with Boethius, with Virgil, with Dante, with Boccaccio. She's constantly engaging with them and echoing them, expecting you as a reader to notice, but she's doing something different. I find that interesting.
So let's start building the city.
Yeah. So anyway, so they go to build this city, and the work is in 3 sections, 3 books. And first they build the walls, the foundations on the walls, and Reason's the one who oversees that process. Then they build the houses and buildings that will be inside the city, and Rectitude helps Christine with that. And then finally they build the roofs and high places, the towers, and populate the city. And it's Justice who helps with that. And finally cap off the city with the sort of procession of the most virtuous lady of them all, the Virgin Mary. And then the city is said to be sealed and closed. So there's this kind of superstructure to the work that's got this, I want to say building metaphor, but like they're actually building the stories themselves are the building blocks that they build with. So each story is a block or a brick or a wall or a roof, right? So it's got this very like tightly structured nature in some ways, right? Like, so if you're interested in the building metaphor, if you look at the beginning and end of each book, you could find interesting, really beautiful, interesting passages about that building process. But then each piece of the city is a little story. And the stories have very different natures. So the first part, if you're thinking about the walls and foundations of the city, if you want to have a place that's going to kind of protect women from all the assaults on their character and bad things that are said about them and roadblocks that are set in their way, well, what do you need in the foundation? What do you need in the walls? You need the toughest, most wild, most warrior-like women imaginable. And that's what she starts with.
Yeah, you need some Amazons.
You do. You totally need Amazons. The one she starts with, though, is the Queen of Babylon, Semiramis. And we don't talk about her a lot today, but in the Middle Ages, she shows up in all these histories as an example of depravity. Boccaccio mentions her in his works. Dante mentions her in his Inferno, something that I think we'll probably talk about before too long. He talks about Semiramis being in hell as someone who violated the law in a very bad and perverted way. And Christine, as she does every time, turns the story around. She tells the story of Semiramis, but she tells it aslant, right? She tells it in a different way. And she'll do that with each of these women like Medea, that for Ovid was like a kind of a horrible witch person who is capable of terrible atrocities. For Christine is a really learned woman who's a master of her craft. And she turns everyone, Dido from the Aeneid, she turns every one of those stories around.
This is one of the most interesting things about Christine's approach in this text is that, I mean, it's an argumentative book in the sense that it's taking an argument that has been presented and accepted and trying to say, that's not quite right. But it's doing it by not really disagreeing with any of the facts that have been presented by the male authority figures that are using these for misogynistic purposes, but instead saying, all of your facts are right. You're just not understanding how they're put together.
Yeah.
So it's this weird sense of like, yeah, that's all true. But think about it this way.
Yeah. Well, it's all in how you tell the story.
Yeah.
And that's something that she is clearly really interested and really committed to thinking through. The story that she's been told, like you mentioned misogyny, the story that she's been told is that women are stupid, women are bad, women are prone to sin. They're prone to lead men into sin. They're unintelligent. They're not articulate. They're always gossiping, like all this stuff, right? Which, is the mud, right? That you have to get out of the way when you want to build the city of ladies. And so in each case, she's going to tell the story again, but she's going to tell it a little bit differently. And she's told to do this in the City of Ladies by Reason, who says this really neat thing to her very early on. She says to Christine, she says, my advice to you is to read those passages where they criticize women in this way and to turn them to your advantage, no matter what the author's original intention was. In other words, she's not saying distort the facts. She's saying recognize that the facts that are in the accounts you've gotten, they've been told in a way to make women look bad. And you got to look through and find the facts and tell the story again. That's what Christine's doing.
It's such a fantastic passage and such a great and liberating way of thinking about how to go about reading. And it's also a relevant one in that I think this is a method that a lot of underrepresented or marginalized groups have used to be able to reclaim bits of their own history. This whole looking at it and saying, yeah, but like I bet we can find a more interesting way of reading what just happened, and one that fits in with our needs, rather than the needs that we've all agreed upon, so to speak, as a society, are the important needs.
Yeah. Well, Christine's very committed, though, I think. I think we'd be comfortable with understanding it in those terms, telling the story in a way that we need, a story that meets our concerns, that tells the story we need to hear right now. And Christine's very careful not to put it in those terms, because she doesn't want to be saying, I'm contradicting these earlier writers, that I'm telling a story in a new way. What she's really committed to doing is saying, they're telling the story in a bad way, in a distorted way. What I'm doing is I'm kind of pulling out the original elements. And so she doesn't use that language of truth, like, telling you the true story, but she's basically cleaning off all the shit, right? She's like cleaning off all the muck that's distorted what's actually in there, which is why I think you get metaphors, interesting metaphors, like in book 2, when she starts out the second book of the City of Ladies, which is going to be about learned women who are capable of tremendous prophetic deeds, who are incredibly intelligent, who are learned, and also women who are good wives or good daughters, right? Who are in family relations, and that's how they excel. In that book, she starts that one out with sibyls, that is, prophets from the ancient world. And they're said to be shining stones. Rectitude says to Christine, come on over here. I've laid out for you these beautiful shining stones. They're all ready for you to lay as cornerstones for building the buildings of the City of Ladies. And that idea of the shining stones, I mean, those I think are, in the stories with all the dreck cleared off of them, doesn't use the language of truth, but clean, shining, that kind of language she uses.
Well, maybe let's continue with this overview. So that's what we have in book 2, the buildings, the sort of primary buildings of the city, brought about by Lady Rectitude.
Part 1 is about the warriors and rulers, about these women who are capable of tremendous force and strength, right? These are the outer walls of the city and the foundations, right? They have to be strong. They don't have to be delicate and beautiful, right? They have to be hard and tough. And then we get into the last book of the City of Ladies. These are going to be the roofs and the highest places. These are going to be women who are distinguished for their religious purity and power expressed in that domain. These are going to be the virgin martyrs. And the middle book is different. It's doing something kind of different. As I said, we have sibyls, we have prophets, we have women of tremendous learning, we have women who are in family relations, whether they're distinguished as wonderful wives or as exemplary daughters or mothers. And you might ask, what do these all have in common with one another? I think what they have in common with one another is this kind of folding out of Christine's own autobiographical concerns and commitments. That account of women's learning will include things like Novella, a woman who's said to be the daughter of a law professor at Bologna, who's even more learned than her father, who was famous for his learning. And she was able, through her father's support and recognition, to also be able to lecture in the law faculty of Bologna, which was a really famous, renowned faculty. But she had to do so from behind a screen, right? So her body had to be hidden so it wouldn't corrupt the people who were listening to her voice. And it's right after she tells the story of Novella that Christine has this really interesting exchange with Rectitude, because they start talking about Christine's own upbringing. And Rectitude says this. She says, your own father, who was a great astrologer and philosopher, did not believe that knowledge of the sciences reduced a woman's worth. Indeed, as you know, it gave him great pleasure to see you take so readily to studying the arts. Rather, it was because your mother, as a woman, held the view that you should spend your time spinning like the other girls, that you did not receive a more advanced or detailed initiation into the sciences. Despite your mother's opposition, you did manage to glean some grains of knowledge from your studies, thanks to your own natural inclination for learning. It's like, whoa, throw mom under the bus, right? And she does this elsewhere too. She has this other incredibly intense autobiographical passage in one of her other works that's called the Livre de la Mutation de Fortune, the Book of the Changes of Fortune, which is wild. And it's partly a history of the world, but the first book of that work is an allegorical autobiography. So she's telling her own autobiography, but in these wildly fantastical terms. And she talks there too about her father and his nourishing of her learning, and her mother as really tearing that down. I mean, that's a slightly earlier work where she was pulling absolutely no punches about her own mother's opposition to her learning. When you talked earlier about responses in the classroom to the City of Ladies, I can't help but think about Christine's mother. It's not a surprise that the kinds of things Christine is preoccupied with, they're not just alienating to men, they're alienating to women, right? Why?
I think it's also worth underlining, although this might be a bit obvious, that she's not interested in just saying all women are great.
No.
Or all men are evil.
No.
It's very much there are good and there's good and bad on both sides, I suppose, so to speak. But
well, sort of there, but I wouldn't want to fall into both sides, right? I mean, she's really clear that our society, when she's talking about our society, our society is set up in a way that puts men in a particular position. I mean, she doesn't say the patriarchy, but she's talking about the patriarchy. That is what she's talking about. So individual human beings obviously can be more or less virtuous. And in her other works, like in her biography of the King Charles V, she's endlessly talking about his virtue in a very nuanced and interesting way. She has another book called the Livre de la Corps de Politique, the Book of the Body Politic, it's called. And there too, she talks about people's roles in society, male and female, all in a very nuanced and subtle way. So she makes room for people's individual virtue. She's absolutely into that. But the structure we live within, she is real clear about this. And there's a lot of mud you have to slog through. So in these autobiographical moments, it's kind of neat to think about what is she doing there. I don't think she's just being self-indulgent saying, I'm going to talk about myself here. She's clearly intelligent. She's figured out that talking about herself has a certain kind of rhetorical force. And she does that in the opening of the City of Ladies, but she also does it at this moment that's nested almost exactly like in the middle of the text in these examples of other women. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the next thing she turns to, almost as soon as she finishes that passage, talking about women's learning, people like Novella, her own experience, she then turns to a section on dutiful daughters who do just the right thing. And she gives examples of this. And one of them is this really striking example of a woman who her mother's in prison and is starving to death. And the daughter happens to have recently had a child. And so she's lactating, right? She's still nursing her baby. So she goes to the prison and covertly nurses her mother so that her mother doesn't starve to death, which sounds like really weird. But Christine makes this, makes a point out of it. And she says, so it was that the daughter gave back to the mother what she had given her as an infant. And you might ask then, why that move, right? Why do you go from talking about women's learning, women's capacity for learning and for teaching, and Christine's own frustrations, and having been held back not by her father, but by her mother. And then the next couple chapters are on daughters who do just what they ought to do. There's something very complicated and interesting going on in book 2, I think.
So Lady Justice builds the lofty heights of the city, the parapets that you see from afar, and includes a lot of martyred saints, the Virgin Mary, and other particularly religiously excellent women like that. At this point in the story, the city's already being populated. There's a description.
Yeah, that starts like partway through book 2, I think. Yeah,
where the women are starting to move in, even though it's like a modern condo building. You move in before there's
still some painting to do, but it's almost done.
Yeah, and then we have the very end of the book, which it ends somewhat abruptly.
Yeah, what do you think about that?
I think it's interesting that she never describes it as a lived space. That it always is. It's this plan for a planned community, and you hear a lot of the details about what's going to be there and who's going to be in it, but you never get those kinds of scenes of lived
life.
Yeah, which I wouldn't expect. Like, that's not a typical way for a medieval parable with personifications to go.
Yeah. Well, she's kind of doing something really interesting there. She's closing it off. There's a lot of language around the city being sealed. It's finished. It's closed. There are keys for it. There's a tremendous amount of emphasis on closure, that it's not an open-ended city. It's a city that's finished. And we might want to ask ourselves, well, what's going on there? Like, why is that necessary? Why does the city have to be represented in this closed way as opposed to an open-ended way? I think one way of addressing that would be to talk about the extent to which the city is understood as a kind of a metonym or a parallel to the woman's body. Right. If the city is always kind of representing, it has an organic kind of quality to it. A city as identified with women has to be sealed, like the Virgin Mary, right? A fountain sealed, right? A garden locked, a fountain sealed, right? So that's part of it. The other reason is there's a kind of part two, City of Ladies Strikes Back, right? She writes this thing that's called the Book of the Three Virtues. And it's a book she writes a little bit later that's really, it's also in three parts. It's kind of a conduct manual. Like once you're living in the City of Ladies, this is the stuff you ought to do. And it's described in terms of different sort of social or class levels, what kinds of things are expected of you, how you might live. And it's not quite as interesting, I think, as the City of Ladies itself. But she's clearly mindful of that. This question of lived experience is also a thing you have to talk about, but she's going to hive that off from this more abstract account of the city itself.
That's the text that has also been translated as the Treasury of the City of Ladies?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, you get both titles.
That's interesting, the idea that it's setting up a space for a kind of sequel. I mean, of course, also the other metonymy going on is that it is the book. And so naturally, when the book is being finished, you seal it. And I wonder if there's any sense of authorial ownership going on there. In other words, I'm finishing this book, therefore no one is invited to come along and write extra chapters to it.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And, that's very much in keeping with one of her big literary models, Dante, right? He does the same thing in the Divine Comedy, right? It's in three parts and it's so tightly braided together. You cannot possibly insert something in there if you wanted to. She's always thinking about literary models, and I would not hesitate to think about when you're writing a work in three parts, she's thinking a little bit about the comedy. She's very explicitly talking with and back to Dante and some of her other works, like her Chemin de Longue Etude, or her Path of Long Study, a book she wrote like 2 years before.
So time is running short for us. So
I know there's too much to talk about.
There's so much, and you are filled with lots of great information about it. Why don't we look at a few of the individual biographies?
Okay.
And maybe we might focus on somebody who we've already encountered in one of the books that we've read.
Were you thinking of one in particular?
Well, Io shows up here in an interesting way.
Yeah, she does. And I remember when we talked about Io in connection with Ovid's Metamorphoses, it was a great passage. And I remember you had a lot of thoughts about Ovid's take on Io. What do you think about what Christine does with her? Because she does something quite different. It's clear we're talking about the conventional story of Io that we have from Ovid, but she's juxtaposed that or kind of fused it with another figure, Isis.
Yeah. So as you may remember, Io is raped by Jupiter and turned into a cow, and then tries to communicate to her father that it's her, that she's been turned into a cow, and does this by tracing her name with her hoof. And so it's the letter I and O, which are easy for a cow to trace. In this, we have Isis, one of the Egyptian gods, and that part of her story is tied in with the creation of language.
Yeah.
And the creation of hieroglyphs in particular, the sort of picture language, which is interesting. I'm not sure why these stories got conflated for her.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things going on there, I think. I mean, one is that she's really interested in this whole question of women being involved at the foundations of things. So the account of Semiramis, for example, the Queen of Babylon, she's a figure who appears in the foundations, the very earliest parts of world histories, universal histories. So she's going to appear in Christine's world history in that foundational kind of way. And Io, too, here, Christine tells the story of Io again in one of her other works, her letter to Athea, where she describes that story. She's clearly interested in it. And she comes back to it here in the City of Ladies, conflating it with the account of the invention of hieroglyphs. So it's not just a one-off like, oh, look, the weird cow is writing in the dirt, right? It's women making language. And she does that in the story of Io that she conflates with Isis, but she also does it in another story a little bit later on, a woman called Nicostrata, who also is said to invent the alphabet, the Latin alphabet that we have now. So this whole question of women being at the beginning of things, it's not just about warfare. It's not just about history. It's also about language, women being in at the ground floor at the very beginning. But the other thing that's going on there in that account of Io that she's conflating with Isis is that she's got these gods here. She's got Isis, the Egyptian goddess, but she's also got Juno and Minerva and Ceres and all these other goddesses. And they show up not as goddesses, but as regular women who were so great and so remarkable that they get described as goddesses. This is a thing that's called euhemerism. It's basically telling an account of the gods that suggests that they were real human beings who got to be understood as gods. And Christine doesn't invent this idea. She gets it from Boccaccio, who does this, but she really goes to town with it. She's really emphasizing that, like, as opposed to what we saw in the Iliad, right, where there were different levels of being, right? There were humans and there were the gods, and they were almost like, it was like a layer cake, right? They were carrying out action on two different levels. And sometimes you had a crossover. Either a god would come down and impregnate a human, or in the case of the goddesses, right, sleep with a human man. And then offerings to the gods, like sacrifices, go back up into the heavens. But by and large, they're two different domains. Christine has like completely broken that down. The goddesses are in the world, and also the personifications, as you said before, they get down in the trenches and they build the city with you. And it's interesting to think about what a different view of divinity is happening there, right? At least in terms of what we've seen, compared to what's in Homer or Ovid.
And then we end with Martyrs.
Yeah.
And in particular, a very long passage about Christine.
Yeah.
Not Christine de Pizan, but Saint Christine, I guess.
Yeah, the one she's named after.
The one she's named after, yeah.
Again, it's a really interesting part of the narrative, isn't it? Because the account of Saint Christine is a particularly interesting one, and one we could talk about. But when you read the narratives of the Virgin Martyrs, do they strike you as very different stories, one to the other? Or do you have a little bit of a sense of déjà vu, like, oh my God, yet another story of grotesque martyrdom?
So I don't tend to read them one after the other like that. I know full well.
You know where the story's going to end, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you want to read the interesting ones, and you want to just dabble in them, and that will keep them fresher for somebody who isn't religiously invested in these stories.
Yeah, because there's different ways of reading, right? And that's something that is really important to bear in mind when we're reading a text from a time so different from our own, right? The way our horizon of expectation with stories like this really different from what a 14th or 15th century reader might have had. For a devout reader, and that might mean a 14th or 15th century reader, but it could also mean a devout reader in contemporary times. You read in order to have a certain kind of spiritual experience. So what might feel repetitive to somebody who's just reading for reading pleasure, it's going to look really different if you're reading with another goal.
Another interesting set of stories around here are the so-called cross-dressing saints.
They're so great. What did you think about them? They show up in, I think, a little bit. I'm trying to remember exactly where they show up. Right?
Basically, they're in book 3, I believe, aren't they?
Yeah, they're definitely in book 3. Yeah, I was trying to remember if they were after some of these really climactic scenes of martyrdom, and they are. They're soon after those climactic scenes of martyrdom. So they're, I guess you could say, even higher, right? Even loftier in some sense. In other words, the order in which Christine deals with these saints' lives is really important. So she's given us this sort of increasing escalation of violent scenes of martyrdom, and finally climaxing with the account of Saint Christine, who Justice says very explicitly, to Christine, the narrator, you're named after, your patron saint. So this is clearly, we're getting to a kind of a high point. And it's after them that we get what you described just a moment ago, and people often will describe as the cross-dressing saints, Marina and Euphrosyne. And those are really weird little stories in themselves, and also in how people read them and how people respond to them, what they think is going on there in terms of gender. What do you think about them? Or were you struck by those the first time you read those scenes?
I was. So they're scenes of women who are dressed up, disguised as men. Mm-hmm. One of them, Marina, her father enters a monastery, and then basically for her safety, I guess, brings her along with. But
he says he had to leave his son behind, right, and he's really worried about him. And that's her.
And that's what she's doing. And she's doing very well. She's a very good monk. And then in the town, there is a bit of a scandal, and the innkeeper's daughter gets pregnant. And
she says it's him.
Yeah. And Marina, or Marinus, as her male name, gets accused. And because she is very good and devout, she doesn't deny it. She's willing to take the punishment. She's willing to do the demeaning deeds that she's tasked with as punishment for this. And then when she passes away, they realize the truth. They realize that she had been martyring herself the whole time. And
so the question is, what is she really? Right? I mean, people have begun to read some of these stories of saints who live as men. Not in Christine's account, but in other medieval accounts, scholars have started to read them in terms of, in more critical terms. For a period of time, they were always understood as cross-dressing saints who disguise themselves in the way you might wear a disguise to, I don't know, very deliberately. But you can also read them as people who live their lives in another kind of way. And that opens up all kinds of possibilities, transgender identities, other kinds of identities, right? And it's particularly historians who work on these kinds of saints' lives, right? I've been interested in trying to figure out what was going on there socially. What's interesting for us is that Christine takes these stories and she kind of, I have to say, tames them. She contains them within a very, I think, really careful gender dynamic. Because you notice with St. Marina, she takes the blame. She continues to live as a man. She accepts responsibility for that pregnancy. And then when that child falls to her, she becomes responsible for that child. She begs for scraps. She feeds that child. She raises that child. And that always struck me as a moment where we as readers we're not being allowed to forget for 1 minute, oh, she's really a woman. And so I get the sense that while it's a transgressive story, it's also a story that Christine works hard to contain. And I think one of the reasons that strikes me as so interesting is she does that like all the time, right? She's someone who's willing to go a certain distance out on a limb, whether it's about gender or about other kinds of possible social reform and so on. She'll go so far and she pulls back. I can understand why you'd be that kind of person living in the world she was living in, but it's frustrating sometimes because you're like, no, go burn it down. But she doesn't. She will not burn it down.
I think that's another thing that, to bring this back, I think that's another thing that some of our students were frustrated with because her critique doesn't go far enough.
No, I totally agree.
And especially for some of these students they're teenagers, a lot of them, and they enter with a chip on their shoulder about religion in particular. And so the idea of buying into traditional Christian values, so to speak, and the idea of buying into the patriarchy are deeply connected to them. And this idea that there are more nuanced approaches isn't something that they're as familiar with, where you might be able to thread the needle there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't think they have any conception of how constrained the space within which you could work was, which is not to let her off the hook, but man, it's real hard to even claim that tiny little space, right?
So Christine de Pizan is often described as the first female professional writer, or at least in a European context. I don't know. They don't often qualify it that way. So what does that mean? Like, how did she make her money, and how did that affect the writing that came out?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We have other earlier women writers in Europe, people like Marie de France, Roswitha of Gandersheim, Hildegard of Bingen, and their circumstances are very different. For Christine, when we say she's a professional woman writer, she's someone who makes a living off writing. She doesn't have a separate means of financial support. And when we say she makes a living off writing, we mean two things. One is that she has a kind of a patronage network. She's established a relationship, not just with the ruling family, but also with relatives of the king at that time, Charles VI, his wife, Isabel, the queen, other members of that family. So she's got these patronage relationships. But she's also deeply committed to and deeply involved with manuscript production, by which I mean making actual physical books. We know a lot about her in this respect because we have presentation copies of her manuscripts. As part of her relationship with her patrons, she would commission professional scribes and professional artists to make these manuscripts, but she would correct them in her own hand. Her own handwriting has been recognized, and so we can see her making corrections, making alterations, giving directions. She's actually supervising it, and we can tell a lot about a person's training and experience by the way they write. It's not just that she knew how to write. She wrote in what's called a secretary hand. That is a professional scribal hand. And so you have to ask, where would she have learned to do that? I mentioned before she was married as a teenager to a man called Etienne de Castel, who was a member of the king's court, who was trained himself as a scribe and who served kind of diplomatic functions. And so we don't know for a fact, but it makes sense that he might have shared some of his scribal labor with her. I mean, she must have learned somewhere, right? So it's either from him or someone else, right? So she knew how to do this and oversaw this process. And so when we look at the manuscripts that she oversaw, we see somebody who's, I want to say, a real control freak, right? She's someone who really supervises every circumstance of production. The portraits that open up these manuscripts, you see depictions of Christine herself offering her book physically to the patron, whether it's a queen or another kind of noble. And so she's really interested in constructing an image of herself that would go out in the world. And that's how she's making her living.
And I think it's worth pointing out that this is fantastically rare.
Oh, very rare, absurdly rare. Yeah. I mean, to be fully engaged in the material production. Yeah. There are other writers like Boccaccio is a good example who also kind of supervises his manuscript production. But it's unusual to supervise at this level. She's, I think, one of the most extreme cases I can think of. And, she's clearly worked out a kind of a system of literary production and manuscript dissemination. And I mean, I'm tempted to think about that as really integral to her process, that was really important to her to have that level of control. And she talks about it too. Like, there was this, I don't know if it struck you, but there's this lovely moment in the City of Ladies where she's talking about women writers and artists. And she mentions this one artist, Anastasia. Actually, I think it's Rectitude who says something about it, and you yourself know that there's this wonderful artist, Anastasia, who is known for her borders, and they have a little conversation about this. So they're actually alluding to the manuscript production that Christine herself is engaged with, and kind of letting us get a glimpse of a community of women manuscript producers in early 15th century Paris. We know they're out there, right? But we have very little documentary evidence about these women working, and Christine gives us a really valuable piece of that puzzle.
It's also just fun to imagine how that may have gotten included. Anastasia may have been remarkable, but there's also the sense of, if you do this, I'll mention you in my book.
Yeah, maybe.
If you put down in history, this is going to be a big deal book. I'll make you a character.
Yeah, I'll advertise your borders, right? Your decorative borders. Yeah. Yeah, no, there's this whole world of, like you were saying, one of the things about the City of Ladies is that it's kind of abstract and theoretical, and that is true. But you get these little glimpses once in a while of a real world with real women in it here and there in the text. And that, I find those moments very compelling. It's like a little window opening up.
It's also very much like Dante, who was also not afraid to have people who were still alive.
Yeah, not afraid of anything as far as I know.
But was definitely putting contemporaries into hell, into the inferno.
Yeah.
So
yeah, she's not going to do that. She'll say nice things about people,
right.
But if she's saying mean things, she will not name names.
Well, there's a lot more that we could say about Christine de Pizan and the Book of the City of Ladies, but I think we just have to wrap it up now.
Yeah, well, I think we've opened up a lot of interesting lines of thinking. And when we're doing our next episodes on Little Women and on the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, I suspect a lot of these questions will come up again in other forms.
And I really want to encourage everybody who hasn't read it yet to at least read the first 2 chapters of the book. It is really remarkable, and I think a must read, and obviously not that long and not that difficult. So next time we'll be talking about Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. It'll be the first book that we've talked about that in a certain sense was intended for children.
Well, yeah, this whole question of children's literature and women, what kinds of things women appropriately might write about or for, or who they might write for, that is something I think we might end up talking about. And it's going to be a very different choice in a lot of ways. Like it's a book I find really interesting. I think you find it interesting for slightly different reasons. I think we'll have a good conversation about it, but I've never taught it. And I think I might have taught a little excerpt of it once way back when I was like in grad school, but like really minimally. But it will be very interesting to think about it as being in a conversation with other books, thinking about it as being in a conversation with Christine de Pizan, in a conversation with Gertrude Stein, and maybe in a conversation with some other works that we're going to talk about later on. I haven't thought about it that way, and that'll be really fun to do together.
So if any listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. Show notes with links for all the things we've mentioned in this episode will be available in your podcast app ideally, but you can also go to megaphonic.fm/spouter/4. And while you're there, you can check out some of the other fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
we'll see you again at the Spouter-Inn.